My Mother, The Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fortuna Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timiro Abdussamid Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. With Alzheimer's, I realized, came layers of loss, even though I couldn't accept it. Some of those losses came gradually, like my mother's inability to make dishes she'd made for decades. One night, she added the sugar into the lentil soup and the salt in the tea. We had to throw both out. The next day, she had the pasta and the rice together in the same pot, making a congealed dish of flour. We had to throw that out too. Also, my mother's paranoia, saying this was gone and this was missing. Things had been moved and misplaced. The fact that she always was on the move, putting her clothes in a bag, ready to go because she wanted to go home, even though she was home. Other losses came as fast as they were startling, like my mother's inability to maintain her balance. She would fall because she walked too fast and her legs would go out from under her. But when I reminded her, Mom, use the walker because you're going to fall otherwise, she wouldn't listen because she can't remember she'd just fallen just half a minute ago. She wanted money all the time, not from me, not from my siblings. She would ask for money anybody that came into the house. It didn't matter who they were, whether they were the workers that came from the agency that were offering care to us, or a family friend, or the next door neighbor that walked in. Her hand was always extended. As soon as she saw the person, she would ask them for money. That always made the visitors very uncomfortable. Even if I explained to them this is part of her dementia and she doesn't know what she's doing, it was hard for the visitors, especially if that was the first or the second time somebody came to my house. It was hard for the person to accept this is what's going on. Because like I was before my mother was diagnosed, and I couldn't understand why the paranoia and all these other symptoms were part of dementia. To me, like to most people, dementia is forgetting things. But asking people for money is not forgetting. That was the challenge. So to deal with that, what we did was we gathered as much monopoly money as we could get. And each time somebody came into the house, I gave them a bundle of the monopoly money. Because my mother, if you gave her something, she'll put it away. She doesn't even know where she put it. And then she's going to extend her hand 2-3 minutes later. So I would tell the person, have this bundle and keep on giving it to her. And when she misplaced it or left it back in the living room, we grabbed it back and put it back in the bowl. So that's how we tried to mitigate, even though it didn't take care of the situation fully. That's how we tried to mitigate. So people coming into the house didn't feel like embarrassed or uncomfortable or put out, and they could just be comfortably visiting. Next, a change that came fast was my mother saying she didn't eat. If I asked her, do you want a snack? A couple hours later, she'll say, what are you talking about? We didn't have lunch. You didn't give me anything for the whole day. What are you talking about? I'm just saying, Mom, we just ate lunch. It was like a little bit over an hour ago. If you're hungry, I'll give you something else. But I already gave you lunch. So there I was again, defending myself and trying to correct my mother, even though I knew there was no correcting it. It was just this habit of right away me getting defensive about what my mother was saying or what my mother was doing. It came to a head one year when my mother visited my brother who was living in the States at the time. And my sister-in-law would give my mother something to eat, lunch or whatever, because she just had a baby and she was off work. But when my brother came home, the first thing my mother would say is nobody gave her anything to eat for the entire day. And it would make my sister-in-law so uncomfortable. And that reminded me, I remember when I was growing up in the small town, I grew up in Somalia, there was this elderly lady who was a grandmother to our next door neighbors. And that lady would walk around, and because she was still very mobile, and nobody really knew about dementia or Alzheimer's at the time. But if you were going to the market to go to the mill or pick up butter or something, some errands in the market, she would ask you, okay, here's a penny or 2 pennies. Can you pick up bananas for me? Or can you pick up a jar of sesame seed oil, which people liked back there? So you would go and pick up that for her. But when you came back and gave it to her, she'd forgotten that she gave you the money to buy this for her. And she's just saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for giving this beautiful gift, because she thinks you are giving it to her at the time. And she was telling everybody who would listen, the ladies in the village, that she is always hungry and her family is not feeding her. They are not taking care of her. And the whispers of the gossip mill were churning that this family were a cursed family because they are not taking care of their grandmother. Now looking back, I'm realizing that elderly grandmother must have had a form of dementia, that she was forgetting she just had a meal, but people didn't understand it and they just assumed that she was being neglected. So in order for me to deal with my mother saying nobody fed her, instead of getting myself into that defensive mode of saying, no, mom, you just ate, it was an hour ago. Every time she said that, I would just say, okay, I am working on lunch now. So here's a snack now. Here's a banana or a piece of apple or a cracker or something. Have this. And I'm working on lunch now. I should be done in the next 20 minutes. And that was it. And that solved the issue just temporarily, not for good. But as soon as I took myself out of it and stopped feeling defensive about what my mother was saying, the issue didn't go away, but the way it was making me question my ability to care for my mother was out of the way. And I was able to take care of my mother. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want to also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories, reconstructed from my childhood memory. Nietzsche, Kane, and Timiro arrived at a large stone house. A metal chain link fence surrounded the structure. He unlocked the wooden gate by putting a hand over and unlatched it from inside. Timiro hadn't seen a big house before. The homestead in the village sat on big parcels of land, but the homes themselves were tiny, always dictated by need. A room to sleep, a common room, a cooking shed, an outhouse. At the sight of the mammoth structure, Timiro expected to see several families living in there. Instead, an older woman approached them as soon as they stepped into the courtyard. The woman took 2 steps toward them. Welcome home. She tried to smile but changed her mind just as her lips opened, exposing a gap where her 2 front teeth should have been. This is Aliso. Nietzsche Kane pointed at the woman with the toothless smile. She will help you take care of the house. Timiro didn't know what that meant, Not until later, when she found out that the woman was a housekeeper, as someone hired to look after the home affairs. "Aliso, this is my wife, Timiro." As if that was Nietzsche Kane signing off his responsibility, he stepped aside and walked away. "Come with me, madam," Alice said, and extended a hand to Timiro as soon as Nietzsche Kane disappeared into the house. "Madam?" Timiro was shocked with such a reference, but the woman hadn't noticed her reaction as she led her through a room with one oversized chair and two small ones arranged in a semicircle fashion. Timiro stopped and stared at it, for she had never seen chairs with big fluffy cushions before. A rectangular table on a large, stunning Persian rug held an incense burner in the middle. On the west wall of the room hung a portrait of a woman. The large and imposing image stared at Timiro, and she returned the gaze. She wanted to stop looking at the woman in the portrait, but she couldn't. Once her eyes landed, Timiro couldn't look away. "She died this 3 years ago. May Allah rest her soul." Alice's word came from the distance, and Timiro wasn't sure if it was the photo speaking to her or the housekeeper. She loved this house so much. Who is she? The desire to know everything about the woman welled deep within Timiro. That was Isa's first wife. Alice paused here. She was so happy when Isa built her this house. The housekeeper continued, and Timiro realized she didn't need prompting. He thought the house in the village was too small for her because she was with a child. Timiro couldn't imagine how anyone could feel joy within these walls. Every stone added to the suffocating feeling that overwhelmed her. How did she die, she asked. Her interest in the wife that inhabited this place before grew tenfold. The housekeeper moved closer to Timiro. "Childbirth," she whispered, and glanced behind her. Even though they were alone in the room, "She died giving birth to his child." "Did the child die too?" "Yes," the housekeeper said. With that answer, Timiro felt an instant sympathy for Nietzsche Kane, not as a husband, but as another human being. She knew what it felt like to lose double. Joy snatched out of your grasp without warning. "This way, madam." Alice pointed and moved toward the half-open door to her left. Timiro followed her, and the eyes of the photo seemed to follow them in. Alice pushed the door open into the bedroom. It had two single wooden beds on the opposite sides. Each bed had a pearl white sheets over the mattress, a pillow, and fluffy hand-woven blanket. As if the weaver couldn't make up her mind, the blanket consisted on different pieces of fabric sewn together to form a beautiful pattern. Timiro watched as Alice walked over to a small table and two chairs against the back wall and lit a kerosene lamp sitting in the middle of the table. The tiled floor was clean and glistened with an oily substance that gave it a beautiful sheen. "Food will be ready soon," the woman said, and left. Timiro stood there staring into space. This was by far the most luxurious house she'd ever been in. Compared to her family's homestead in the village and that tin room they lived in the city, this was a mansion. But within the walls of this enormous structure, cold and uncaring air skittered over her skin. She felt forlorn, out of place, standing in the middle of that vast room, cut adrift from everything that mattered. A desperate need for a backward motion, a return to the past, a take-back of sort filled Timiro's chest. "You didn't change yet?" Nietzsche Kane came into the room, a wooden toothbrush dangling from his mouth. "Do you need help?" His voice startled Timiro as if she didn't expect him to be there. "Is there an outhouse?" She asked the first question that came to her. The need to get out of the room and away from him overwhelmed her. An outhouse, he laughed. Yes, we call it a bathhouse here. He pointed at the door. Alisa needs a cane, kept Timiro within his gaze. The housekeeper was standing next to Timiro only a few seconds after the call, as if she were waiting by the threshold. Help her settle in, he instructed. Timiro, only too grateful to be away from Nietzsche Kane, followed the housekeeper out of the room, across the courtyard, to a box-looking room. It had 4 walls made with jagged stones. 2 concrete steps led to the wooden door with a metal handle on the outside and lock on the inside. I'll be back shortly. Alisa left Timiro just inside the door. In the bathhouse, Timiro felt constricted, unable to breathe until the housekeeper returned and put a large metal pail filled with warm water next to the cement seat with a hole in the middle. Here, use this to dry after you wash. She handed her a large fluffy towel and a loose house dress. I thought you would never come out. Nietzsche Kane teased Timiro when she joined him in the room with the cushioned chairs. In a ma'awis and grey t-shirt, he looked comfortable, at home, as much as she'd felt alone and isolated. I'm glad you made it out okay. His tone, perhaps intended to cheer her up, made something akin to anger bubble in her throat. But she didn't give words to the rage. No one forced her to marry this man. She agreed to it despite her father's hesitation, so she nodded because she didn't trust herself to speak. Eat something, Nietzsche Kane said as soon as Timiro sat on the chair across from him. Alisa had laid a small feast, a roasted whole chicken cut in 4 quarters, a platter of rice topped with mixed vegetables, a pitcher of sour camel milk, a bunch of bananas, enough food for an entire family. But Timiro didn't want to eat. But with Nietzsche Kane's prodding, she scooped a few spoons out of the rice mix and a chicken leg. That's all? He said as he heaped enough food to feed 3 people in his plate. No wonder you are a twig. Timiro didn't respond to him, and his mouth was too full for another question. They ate in silence for the rest of the meal. The days following her arrival, Timiro tried her best to make that place of rocks, bricks, and cement a home. With Alisa's help, she met a few of the women in the neighboring houses and joined their knitting group. She worked on learning how to make different dishes by watching the housekeeper cook. In her attempt to distract herself, Timiro went to the market with Alisa to buy supplies and helped her clean the house. Nothing distracted her from the desire to go home that filled her inside every second she was alone with her thoughts. You will get used to it after a while, Alisa said as if she could read Timiro's mind. Be patient with yourself. Her determination to adjust, to forget what she left behind and start anew, grew with Alice's sage advice. But the memory of Farah's sobs and the image of her father's hand suspended in mid-air remained her constant companions. No matter how hard she tried, Nietzsche Kane's place remained a mere house, a bed to rest her weary head at night, a bathroom to wash her filthy body from Nietzsche Kane's nightly intrusions. No matter her effort to make it home, the space between the roof over her head and tiles beneath her feet told her it would never be so. That was obvious from the first unfortunate night she'd spent in it. Above all, eating to sustain her energy proved the most challenging task. Alisa did her best to make different dishes, used spices to enliven the meat and rice, but everything tasted the same, bland. She might as well have been eating the red clay mud. You have to try, my dear. Alisa coaxed Timiro every morning. She was so kind to her. So she chewed the morning oatmeal fast and hard to show her gratitude, even though it required neither. You need your energy, Alyssa reminded Timiro between bites. It takes a while to leave home behind. And Timiro did try to eat, and often reminded herself that this was where she belonged. With time, she would grow to like it, but it was all to no avail. After 6 unfortunate weeks since her arrival in Luq, Timiro had a nightmare. In it, she felt her mother's presence. The scent of her mother's hair oil preserved in her memory filled Timiro's nostrils. "What are you doing here?" Timiro asked aloud. "I came to see you, to set you free." Her mother appeared so real. Her hair in 2 long braids rested on her back. "To free me from what?" Timiro asked, still asleep, her eyes closed. "From that." Her mother pointed, and Timiro followed her long silhouette finger to Nitsa Kane's bed. "You don't need to be here. Like you didn't need to be with us." "I couldn't," Timiro's mother said, "but you can return home. Be with your father and brother." "You couldn't or you wouldn't." All the anger and resentment she'd held against her mother came pouring out of Timiro like a broken well pipe. A deluge of wrath covered the space around her, threatening to drown her. "You're asking me to return to those you deserted?" She spoke so loudly it was a miracle she didn't wake up half the city. "You betrayed us, all 3 of us." With that, Timiro bolted right up. Her nightdress clung to her, wet from the sweat that ran from her head down to her chest and hips. By the time Timiro awoke, her eyes wide open, she was shaking with uncontrollable sobs, and her mother wasn't there. Instead, Nitsa Kane was rocking her back and forth. "Hush, you had a nightmare, a terrible nightmare. Hush now," he repeated. "You are safe. Nowhere else to go?" She collapsed on his chest and cried with abandon. My Mother, The Person and the Patient can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.